I still have dreams of walking around the local video stores here in town. I have extremely vivid memories and even remember specific owl placement and plenty of other useless details from the glory days of video. For a brief moment, everything made sense. One of my fondest memories was perusing all the great VHS cover art, row after row of iconic masterpieces plastered on boxes. It's always been a goal of mine to get a hold of the people who are responsible for the great artwork, and I managed to track down Lee Macleod, who worked for Charles Band's Full Moon Pictures during the company's heyday.
Well, the very first thing I did for Charlie Band was Metal Storm, and then this was when this was through Empire though. So the very first of the Full Moon ones that I did was the first Puppet Master. I did a bunch of sketches, and Charlie had a pretty clear idea of what he wanted, and so I did the first round of puppets, and then when they went to the guys that actually built the puppets, they became much more sophisticated than anything I'd envisioned. I'd love to take credit for that, but I can't. They did it, and then afterwards, the poster was based on what they created. Yeah, I did a ton of stuff for the Puppet Masters, and to be honest, I can't even, I did so much art for them, for Puppet Masters, and some of it was pre-production, some was post-production, and some was sort of in between. And so, and generally the stuff was printed in some manner or form and distributed, as teasers for upcoming Puppet Master thing or whatever, and then inevitably something that I did ended up on the box cover or on the actual when you went to buy the film, but kind of different variations. So like I did Six Shooter before Six Shooter was really designed.
Oh, really?
And then he looked completely different, although he had the six arms and the guns. And then but it was sort of set in a kind of more of a, European setting. And so at the time, he wore a black hood over his face, and there wasn't a hat. And then they completely re-envisioned him when they went to make the puppet and turned it into the Six Shooter that we all know now. I mean, Charlie was always, which he fully admits, very interested in, comic books and all that kind of stuff. And I think Dr.Mordrid was sort of, based on the whole concept of Doctor Strange, the Marvel comic. It was pretty cool, to put that thing together. I actually got to, photograph the actor in his costume in my studio, and tried a whole bunch of different poses, more or less variations therein of how the poster finally came out. And then it was like, well, just come up with some really cool, fantastic, strange background, which I had fun doing. So. Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite posters as well. We, photographed the models extensively. There was always usually there's a Dr. Mordrid that I did that, was before they cast anybody, and so obviously it looked different. But once I had access to puppets and anything else, then we would work with photographing them. I did a ton of video games. It's kind of funny because there's these collectors that have basically cleaned me out of all my video game art. But it was a little confusing initially because I was always completely into what the image was and not very into what the game was. And so, people would contact me and say, hey, do you have such and such a game? And I'd go, well, I don't know. You have to send me a picture of it. And, then, oh, yeah, I did do that one. but I just didn't know what they were really for in terms of the games because I never really played games. I just, was totally focused on trying to create an exciting image from whatever was described to me as how the game worked. Yeah, and so initially I think the game artwork was a lot more sophisticated than the games themselves, but then the games caught up, and then once they started getting more sophisticated, they would give us model sheets and things. I mean, we had to stick to stuff really closely once we reached a certain point. But when things were first starting out, there were a lot of games where you just kind of interpreted it. If it was a sword and sorcery thing, and the graphics weren't that good, then you kind of basically had to come up with your own stuff. So anyway, I worked on Trancers, and I think I did pretty much all of those.
Oh, nice.
And I did it once again. I did a bunch of art that was published, but it was published as Charlie put out a ton of pre-production stuff that he would distribute to video stores. This is coming, and get ready for the next best thing. And then once the films were actually finalized, sometimes locations or storylines or something changed, so that we'd have to revise the art.
Do you remember working on anything that didn't get made?
I think it was something called Curse of the Puppet Master. Most things ended up getting made in some variation.
You sent me a really cool picture of Lance Hendrickson posing.
Right. And in that particular poster, there was a poster done before they cast, and then once they knew who was going to be the guy, then we got together and photographed. The girl in that poster is just a friend of mine who was a model at the time, did a lot of modeling for illustrators, and so. But, because her head was turned away, it didn't really matter. Yeah. I kind of got out of the film business, primarily, even with Charlie, at a certain point, he loved working with illustrators, but it became very clear that...
yeah, man, that's why everyone says there was a heyday of Full Moon Pictures. There's been a very obvious and serious drop of quality in the films, and especially the cover art, in the last decade or so, I'd say.
Yeah, there was a period of time there, especially when Paramount was releasing a lot of it, where everybody was into seeing if they could make it, something a little more memorable. And we pushed on the artwork, but also, the costuming and just the concepts and everything were really pretty cool. You could have in-house guys doing some of this stuff because the computer becomes so sophisticated. Yeah. And so then, that kind of closed that down for most of us. So there were a few illustrators that hung in there, either because their styles were so, prominent, like Drew Struzan did, all the Raiders of the Lost Ark stuff, and of course they wanted it to continue to look like that. But a lot of illustrators ended up either trying to switch to the computer or basically going for different directions. I ultimately ended up moving into fine art, and part of it is my style was pretty realistic, and realism is something the computer does extremely well.
Well, hey, man, on behalf of all the other weirdos like me who love this shit, thank you so much for the memories.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I loved it. I loved doing it. Illustration was a lot of fun. There's something to be said for, trying to solve a problem, visually. And how can we make this work? And the puppets come back. I come back to the puppets just because the puppets were always tricky because there were a lot of puppets. So it was like, okay, how do we get all these puppets into something that looks, that's going to work? And, whereas Pit and the Pendulum is a much simpler, more typical film poster look. So, but the puppets were fun in that respect, and it was always a challenge.
Yeah, take it easy, man.
Okay, you as well. Appreciate your interest. Thanks very much.